The fog clung to the Maine coast like a lover who refused to let go, wrapping the harbor in a shroud of secrets. Sophie Turner stood on the pier, her breath visible in the chilly dawn, her heart pounding louder than the waves crashing against the rocks. She'd been summoned here by a woman she'd never met, a woman whose name alone sent shivers through the small fishing town of Port Haven, Captain Elena Voss. Sophie clutched the letter in her trembling hands, its edges worn from rereading. The words were curt, almost cruel. Meet me at dawn. Pier 7. You have no choice. No signature, just the unmistakable crest of the Silver Gale, the ship that ruled these waters. Everyone knew Captain Voss, ruthless, solitary, a woman carved from ice who commanded her crew with a gaze that could freeze the ocean itself. At 28, Sophie had no business with a woman like that. She was a painter, a dreamer, someone who found beauty in the soft curves of seashells and the fleeting hues of twilight. Yet here she was, summoned by a captain who never asked, only demanded. The crunch of boots on gravel snapped her from her thoughts. Elena Voss emerged from the mist, her navy peacoat billowing like a storm cloud. At 32, she was everything the rumors promised. Tall with short dark hair tucked under a cap, and blue eyes that seemed to pierce through Sophie's soul. Her face was sharp, unyielding, but there was something else, a flicker of something softer, buried deep, like a secret she'd forgotten how to tell. You're late, Elena said, her voice low, cutting through the fog. I don't tolerate tardiness. I wasn't given a time, Sophie replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Just a place and a threat. Elena's lips twitched, not quite a smile. A threat? No, Miss Turner. A necessity. She stepped closer, and Sophie caught the scent of salt and cedar, as if the sea itself clung to her. Your brother owes me a debt. A significant one. And you're here to settle it. Sophie's stomach dropped. Her brother Liam had always been reckless, gambling, drinking, chasing dreams that sank faster than his fishing boat. But this? What kind of debt? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. $10,000, Elena said, her eyes never leaving Sophie's. He borrowed it to save his boat. He failed. Now I'm calling it in. I don't have that kind of money, Sophie said, her heart racing. I'm an artist, not a banker. I don't want your money. Elena's voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it. I want your time. 30 nights. You'll work for me on my ship until the debt is paid. Sophie laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. Work for you? I don't know the first thing about sailing. You'll learn. Elena's gaze softened just for a moment before hardening again. Or you can walk away and your brother goes to jail. Your choice. The words hung between them, heavy as the fog. Sophie thought of Liam, his crooked smile, his promises to change. She thought of their mother, already broken by years of his mistakes. She couldn't let him go to prison. But 30 nights with this woman, this cold, unreadable captain, felt like stepping into a storm with no shelter. Fine, Sophie said, her voice shaking. 30 nights. But don't expect me to like it. Elena's eyes flickered with something, amusement, perhaps, or curiosity. I don't expect you to like me, Miss Turner. I expect you to obey. The Silver Gale was a beast of a ship, its dark hull slicing through the waves as Sophie stood on the deck, her hands raw from scrubbing salt-crusted ropes. The crew, a rough mix of men and women, watched her with a mix of pity and suspicion. She was an outsider, a land dweller, and they made no effort to hide it. Elena, meanwhile, was everywhere and nowhere, issuing orders from the helm, her voice carrying over the wind, or disappearing into her cabin for hours, leaving Sophie to fend for herself. The first night was torture. Sophie's muscles ached, her skin burned from the wind, and the crew's laughter stung worse than the salt in her cuts. She collapsed onto a narrow bunk below deck, her mind spinning with questions. Why her? Why not demand the money from Liam directly? And why did Elena's gaze linger on her, even when she thought Sophie wasn't looking? By the third night, Sophie began to notice the rhythm of the ship, the creak of the mast, the hum of the waves, the way the stars seemed brighter at sea. She painted in her sketchbook when no one was watching, capturing the curve of the horizon, the shadow of Elena against the wheel. There was something about the captain that drew her in despite the fear. Elena was a puzzle, a storm wrapped in silence, and Sophie couldn't help but want to unravel her. On the fifth night, a storm hit. The sky turned black, and the silver gale groaned under the weight of the waves. Sophie clung to the railing, her heart in her throat, as Elena barked orders, her voice steady despite the chaos. When a rope snapped, nearly sending a crewman overboard, Elena dove into the fray, her strength hauling him back to safety. Sophie watched, breathless, as the captain's coat whipped in the wind, her face fierce and alive. "You!" Elena called, spotting Sophie frozen on deck. "Get below. Now." "I can help," Sophie shouted over the storm, surprising herself. Elena's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. "Tie down the sails. Follow my lead." For the first time, Sophie felt the ship's pulse under her hands, the thrill of being part of something bigger. She worked beside Elena, their movements synchronized, their eyes meeting in fleeting moments of understanding. When the storm passed, the crew cheered, and Elena's hand brushed Sophie's as she passed her a rope. It was brief, but it burned. "You're not useless," Elena said later, her voice gruff as they stood alone on the deck. The stars glittered above, and Sophie's heart raced for reasons she couldn't name. "Thanks, I think," Sophie said, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. Elena didn't smile back, but her eyes softened just for a moment before she turned away. "Get some rest. We've got 25 nights left." Sophie watched her go, her heart a tangled knot of fear and something else, something dangerous, something alive. She didn't know it yet, but the 8th night would change everything. The days blurred into a rhythm of salt and sweat, each one carving Sophie deeper into the world of the silver gale. She learned to tie knots that held against the fiercest winds, to read the stars for navigation, to anticipate Elena's orders before they left her lips. The crew's suspicion softened, replaced by grudging respect, but it was Elena's attention that unsettled her most. The captain watched her not with the cold scrutiny of the first day, but with something warmer, something that made Sophie's skin prickle under her gaze. On the 7th night, Sophie found herself alone on the bow, sketching the moon's reflection on the water. The ship was quiet, the crew below deck, and the air carried a rare stillness. She didn't hear Elena approach until the captain's shadow fell across her page. "You draw the sea like you've known it forever," Elena said, her voice softer than Sophie had ever heard it. She stood close, her shoulder brushing Sophie's, and the air between them felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. "It's beautiful," Sophie said, her pencil stilling, "even when it's cruel." Elena's laugh was low, almost bitter. "The sea's not cruel. It's honest. People are the cruel ones." Sophie looked up, meeting Elena's eyes. They were unguarded for the first time, and Sophie saw something raw there, pain maybe, or longing. "What made you like this?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "So cold." Elena's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Sophie thought she'd crossed a line. But then the captain leaned against the railing, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I wasn't always," she said quietly. "But the sea takes things. People. Promises. It leaves you with nothing but walls to keep you standing." Sophie wanted to ask more, to peel back the layers of this woman who seemed both invincible and broken. But Elena straightened, her mask slipping back into place. "Get some sleep," she said, her voice firm again. "Tomorrow's a long day." The 8th night came like a thief, stealing Sophie's breath and rewriting her heart. The silver gale had docked at a small port to resupply, and the crew scattered into the town's taverns, leaving the ship eerily quiet. Sophie was in the galley scrubbing pots when Elena appeared in the doorway, her coat unbuttoned, her hair loose for the first time. She looked younger, almost vulnerable. "You don't belong here," Elena said, her voice low, almost accusatory. "You're too soft for this life." Sophie set down the pot, her hands shaking. "Maybe I'm tougher than you think." Elena stepped closer, her eyes searching Sophie's face. "You are," she said, almost to herself. "And that's the problem." The air between them crackled, and Sophie's heart pounded so loud she was sure Elena could hear it. "What's the problem, Captain?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elena's hand reached out, hesitating, then brushed a strand of auburn hair from Sophie's face. The touch was electric and Sophie froze, caught in the intensity of Elena's gaze. "You make me want things I can't have," Elena said, her voice raw. "Things I swore I'd never want again." Before Sophie could respond, Elena closed the distance, her lips crashing into Sophie's with a hunger that stole the air from her lungs. The kiss was desperate, fierce, a collision of need and fear. Sophie's hands found Elena's waist, pulling her closer, and for a moment, the world was nothing but the taste of salt and cedar, the warmth of Elena's breath, the thud of their hearts beating as one. When they pulled apart, Elena's eyes were wide, her breath uneven. "This doesn't change anything," she said, but her voice trembled, betraying her. "It changes everything," Sophie whispered, her fingers still tangled in Elena's coat. Elena stepped back, her walls snapping back into place. 22 nights left," she said, turning away. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." But as she walked away, Sophie saw the way her hands shook, the way she glanced back just once before disappearing into the night. The 8th night had cracked something open in both of them, and there was no going back. The next few days were a dance of avoidance and longing. Elena buried herself in charts and orders, her voice sharper than ever, but her eyes betrayed her, lingering on Sophie when she thought no one noticed. Sophie, meanwhile, felt like she was unraveling. Every brush of their hands, every shared glance, was a spark that threatened to set her heart ablaze. She painted Elena in secret, capturing the curve of her jaw, the storm in her eyes, the vulnerability she hid from the world. On the 12th night, the crew gathered for a rare moment of camaraderie, sharing stories and whiskey under the stars. Sophie sat apart, sketching until Elena joined her, a bottle in hand. "You're always drawing," Elena said, her voice softened by the liquor. "What's in that book of yours?" Sophie hesitated, then handed her the sketchbook. Elena flipped through it, her expression unreadable, until she stopped on a drawing of herself, standing at the helm, her face fierce and beautiful. "This is how you see me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "It's how you are," Sophie said, her heart in her throat. "Strong, beautiful, human." Elena's eyes met hers, and for a moment the world fell away. Then she handed the sketchbook back, her fingers lingering on Sophie's. "You're dangerous, Sophie Turner," she said, but there was no anger in her voice, only a quiet, aching truth. The silver gale sailed deeper into the Atlantic, its course set for a distant fishing ground known only to Elena. The air grew colder, the waves wilder, and the tension between Sophie and Elena became a living thing, pulsing with every glance, every word unspoken. The crew sensed it too, their whispers following Sophie like shadows. "The captains never looked at anyone like that," one muttered. "She's trouble," another said, eyeing Sophie with a mix of envy and warning. Sophie didn't care. She was caught in a current she couldn't fight, drawn to Elena's contradictions, her strength and her fragility, her coldness and the warmth that slipped through the cracks. Every night, Sophie waited for another moment, another kiss, but Elena kept her distance, her orders sharper, her walls higher. It was as if the 8th night had been a dream, a crack in time that Elena was determined to seal shut. On the 15th night, the ship hit a dead calm, the sea glassy and still, mirroring the stars above. Sophie found Elena alone on the deck, her hands gripping the railing, her eyes lost in the sky. "You can't keep avoiding me," Sophie said, stepping closer, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. "I'm not avoiding you," Elena said, but she didn't turn. "I'm protecting you." "From what?" Sophie asked, her voice rising. "From you? Or from what I feel?" Elena spun to face her, her eyes blazing. "You don't know what you're asking for, Sophie. This life, this sure pit destroys everything soft. Everyone I've ever cared about is gone. I won't let that happen to you." Sophie's heart ached at the pain in Elena's voice, the weight of a past she could only guess at. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat of Elena's body. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "And I'm not as soft as you think." Elena's breath hitched, and for a moment, Sophie thought she'd pull away again. But then Elena's hands were on her face, her thumbs brushing Sophie's cheeks, and she kissed her not with the desperation of the 8th night, but with a tenderness that broke Sophie's heart. It was a kiss that spoke of fear and hope, of walls crumbling under the weight of something stronger. When they parted, Elena rested her forehead against Sophie's, her voice barely a whisper. "You're going to ruin me." "Maybe you need to be ruined," Sophie said, her voice trembling with a smile. They stood like that, wrapped in each other, until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. But the calm didn't last. The next day, a crewman named Marcus, a burly man with a grudge against Elena's authority, caught Sophie alone in the hold. "You think you've got her wrapped around your finger?" he sneered. "She's using you, girl. Just like she uses all of us." Sophie's stomach twisted, but she held her ground. "You don't know her." "I know enough," Marcus said, stepping closer. "She's got secrets. Debts of her own. Ask her about the Northern Star." The name meant nothing to Sophie, but it lingered like a splinter in her mind. That night she confronted Elena in her cabin, the air thick with the scent of old books and whiskey. "What's the Northern Star?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Elena froze, her face paling. "Where did you hear that name?" "Marcus," Sophie said. "He said you have secrets. Debts. What's he talking about?" Elena's jaw clenched, and for a moment Sophie thought she'd shut her out. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "The Northern Star was my first ship," she said, her voice hollow. 5 years ago it went down in a storm. I lost everything. My crew. My family. My fiancée, Clara. Sophie's breath caught. "Fiancée." Elena nodded, her eyes distant. "She was like you. Full of light. Too good for this life. I couldn't save her." She looked at Sophie, her gaze raw. "That's why I keep my distance. I can't lose someone again." Sophie reached for her, her hand finding Elena's. "I'm not Clara," she said softly. "And I'm not going anywhere." Elena's fingers tightened around hers, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. "You say that now," she said. "But you don't know what this life costs." The next few nights were a fragile dance of closeness and caution. Sophie learned to read Elena's silences, to see the love in her guarded glances. They stole moments a touch in the galley, a shared laugh under the stars, but the shadow of the Northern Star hung over them, a reminder of the risks they were taking. On the 20th night, a new storm loomed, darker and fiercer than the last. The crew scrambled, their faces tense, and Sophie felt the weight of Elena's fear. As the winds howled, Elena pulled her aside, her voice urgent. "Stay below deck. No arguments." "I can help," Sophie said, her voice firm. Elena's eyes softened, but her voice was steel. "I can't lose you, Sophie. Please." The words hit like a wave, and Sophie nodded, retreating below. But as the storm raged, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bigger than the wind and waves. The storm hit with a fury that shook the silver gale to its bones. Sophie huddled below deck, her sketchbook clutched to her chest, listening to the roar of the wind and the shouts of the crew. Every creak of the ship felt like a warning, every crash of the waves a reminder of Elena's story, the Northern Star, swallowed by a storm like this one. Sophie's heart raced, not just for herself, but for Elena, out there in the chaos, fighting to keep them all alive. When the storm finally broke, the dawn was gray and bruised, the sea littered with debris. Sophie climbed to the deck, her legs unsteady, and found Elena at the helm, soaked and exhausted but unharmed. Their eyes met, and Sophie ran to her, throwing her arms around her without thinking. Elena stiffened, then melted into the embrace, her hands gripping Sophie's sweater like a lifeline. "You're okay," Sophie whispered, her voice thick with relief. "For now," Elena said, her voice rough. She pulled back, her eyes searching Sophie's face. "You shouldn't be up here." "I had to see you," Sophie said, her honesty startling even herself. Elena's expression softened, and for a moment, they were alone in the world, the crew's chatter fading into the background. But the moment shattered when Marcus approached, his face dark with anger. "We lost 2 nets," he said, glaring at Elena. "And a sail's torn. This is on you, Captain." Elena's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. "We're alive, Marcus. That's what matters." He sneered, his eyes flicking to Sophie. "Alive for now. But you're distracted. And it's gonna cost us." The accusation hung in the air, and Sophie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Marcus's words echoed her own fears that her presence was a weakness, a crack in Elena's armor. That night, she found Elena in her cabin, poring over charts, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Marcus is right," Sophie said, her voice quiet. "I'm distracting you. Maybe I should leave when we dock next." Elena's head snapped up, her eyes fierce. "Don't you dare," she said. "You're not the problem. He is." "But what if I am?" Sophie asked, her voice breaking. You said yourself you can't afford to care. What if I'm the reason something goes wrong? Elena crossed the room in 2 strides, her hands cupping Sophie's face. You're the reason I'm still fighting, she said, her voice raw. You're the reason I'm starting to believe I can be more than this ship, this life. Don't take that away from me. The words broke something in Sophie and she kissed Elena, pouring every fear, every hope into it. They clung to each other, the world outside the cabin fading away, until the sound of footsteps jolted them apart. It was just a crewman calling for Elena, but the interruption was a reminder of the world they couldn't escape. The next few nights were a battle against more than the sea. Marcus's resentment spread like poison, turning some of the crew against Elena. Whispers of mutiny circled, and Sophie felt the weight of it, knowing her presence was part of the spark. She threw herself into her work, trying to prove her worth, but the tension grew thicker with every passing day. On the 25th night, Elena called Sophie to her cabin. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, and Elena's face was a mask of determination. We're heading into dangerous waters tomorrow, she said. A fishing ground near the Devil's Reef. It's risky, but the catch could set us up for months. Sophie nodded, her stomach twisting. And Marcus? Elena's eyes darkened. He's pushing for control. If he tries anything, I need you to stay out of it. Promise me. I can't just stand by, Sophie said, her voice firm. I'm part of this now. Part of you. Elena's expression softened, and she pulled Sophie close, her lips brushing her forehead. You're more than that, she said. You're everything. The words were a promise, but they carried a weight that scared Sophie. She'd come aboard to save her brother, but now she was fighting for something bigger for Elena, for herself, for a love that felt both impossible and inevitable. As she left the cabin, she glanced back at Elena, her silhouette framed against the flickering lantern, and prayed they'd both survive what was coming. The 26th night brought the Devil's Reef, a jagged stretch of rocks that seemed to claw at the sky. The crew worked in tense silence, their eyes darting between Elena and Marcus. Sophie felt the storm brewing, not in the sky, but in the hearts of the men and women around her. When a net snagged on the reef, Marcus seized his chance, shouting accusations, rallying the crew to his side. You've lost your edge, Voss, he roared. You're too busy playing house to lead us. Elena stood tall, her voice cutting through the chaos. Anyone who wants to follow Marcus can leave now. But you'll answer to me first. The crew hesitated, torn between fear and loyalty. Sophie's heart pounded, her hands clenched at her sides. She wanted to stand beside Elena, to fight for her, but Elena's warning echoed in her mind. Then Marcus lunged, a knife glinting in his hand, and Sophie's world stopped. Time slowed as Marcus's knife flashed toward Elena, the blade catching the light of the setting sun. Sophie didn't think she acted. She threw herself between them, shoving Elena out of the way just as the knife grazed her arm. Pain seared through her, hot and sharp, but she barely registered it. The crew gasped, frozen as Elena spun, her eyes wild with fury and fear. Sophie! Elena's voice was a raw scream. She caught Sophie as she stumbled, her hands pressing against the shallow cut on Sophie's arm. What the hell were you thinking? I couldn't let him hurt you, Sophie gasped, her vision swimming. Marcus hesitated, the knife still in his hand, but the crew's mood shifted. A woman named Lila, who'd warmed to Sophie over the weeks, stepped forward, her voice steady. That's enough, Marcus. You've gone too far. The mutiny crumbled as quickly as it had begun. The crew turned on Marcus, restraining him, their loyalty to Elena outweighing his poison. Elena didn't spare him a glance. She carried Sophie to her cabin, her hands shaking as she bandaged the wound. You could have died, she said, her voice breaking. Do you have any idea what that would have done to me? Sophie reached for her, her fingers brushing Elena's cheek. I'm okay, she said softly. And so are you. Elena's walls shattered. She kissed Sophie, gentle at first, then fierce, as if she could pour every fear, every unspoken word into that moment. When they pulled apart, tears glistened in Elena's eyes. I love you, she said, the words raw and unguarded. I didn't want to, but I do. Sophie's heart soared, despite the pain in her arm. I love you too, she whispered. And I'm not going anywhere. The 27th night was a turning point. Marcus was confined, the crew's loyalty restored, and the silver gale sailed on its course steady. Sophie's wound healed quickly, but the scar it left was a reminder of what she'd risked and what she'd gained. She and Elena stole moments whenever they could, their love growing in the quiet spaces between storms and stars. On the 30th night, as the silver gale docked back in Port Haven, Sophie stood on the pier where it all began, the fog lighter now, the air warmer. Elena stood beside her, her hand brushing Sophie's, their fingers intertwining. The debt was paid, Liam was safe, but Sophie's heart was tethered to the sea and to the woman who'd changed everything. "You're free now," Elena said, her voice soft but steady. "You don't have to stay." Sophie turned to her, her eyes bright with certainty. "I'm not here because I have to be," she said. "I'm here because I choose you." Elena's smile was small, but it lit up her face, softening the edges of the cold-hearted captain. "Then stay," she said. "Sail with me. Not for 30 nights, but for as long as you want." They kissed under the stars, the waves whispering their approval, and Sophie knew she'd found her home not in Port Haven, but in Elena's arms, in the wild, unpredictable sea that had brought them together. The silver gale would sail again, and they'd face its storms side by side, their love a beacon stronger than any lighthouse. As the fog lifted, revealing the endless horizon, Sophie felt a truth settle in her bones. Love like the sea was vast and untamed, and it was worth every risk. They'd face whispers, doubts, and dangers, but together, they were unstoppable. The cold-hearted captain was no more replaced by a woman who'd learned to love again, and Sophie, the dreamer who'd found her courage, was ready for whatever came next. Thank you for listening. Like and subscribe to get notifications about next videos.